We are really, really pleased to introduce our judge and demo artist for this month. Sherry Roper has been painting since first art class in 2001. She started out in watercolors, largely in botanicals, but has moved to oil. And she now paints still lifes and landscapes, focusing on realism, dramatic light, and detail. She has paintings hanging in private collections nationally and internationally. She has been published in 2 editions of Splash, The Best of Watercolor, and also has been featured in American Art Collector magazine. She's a member of several painting organizations, including Oil Painters of America. She's a signature member of the Oil and Acrylic Painters Society, as well as the San Diego Watercolor Society. So this is a really exciting opportunity for us to get to learn a lot.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm Sherry Roper, and as she stated, I've been painting for many, many years. I started 20-something years ago in watercolor, and the reason I started painting was because I wanted to paint my rose garden that I had just planted. So I started painting flowers out of my garden, and really enjoyed painting flowers and botanicals, and pretty much stayed with painting flowers for many, many years. Joined the San Diego Watercolor Society, and then realized that it might be fun to put other things in the paintings besides flowers. So I morphed into still life and painted still life watercolors for many, many years. And I still paint still life. But after several years, many years of painting watercolor, I became sort of infatuated with classical realism and the old masters and those still lifes that are just so awe-inspiring that you see in museums. And I thought, I want to paint like that. And I realized very quickly that watercolor doesn't lend itself very well to that kind of painting. And I was trying to get that look in watercolor, and it wasn't until I realized you really can't do that in watercolor very well, that I switched to oil. And I switched to oil probably about 2012, 2011. And for a while I was trying to do both watercolor and oil, and as some of you know, it's not the same at all. And I realized fairly quickly that I couldn't really do both very well. And I actually struggled with oil for many, many years because I was taking alla prima oil classes, which alla prima meaning all at once. You just dive in there with color and paint the painting all at once, and it's finished in a day. And I really had a hard time dealing with that because as a watercolorist, I was used to painting in layers, and you let it dry, and then you paint another layer, and you let it dry, and that wasn't the case with alla prima oil painting. So it wasn't until I took a class at the La Jolla Athenaeum from Pat Kelly in the classical traditional method of oil painting, which is like the old masters used to paint, which is considered the indirect method of oil painting, which means it's done in layers, and the layers dry between each layer, and each painting actually starts with some type of underpainting, which in my painting here is a brown underpainting done in raw umber, and it's kind of a wipeout technique. The white is actually the white of the canvas. There's also underpaintings that I do that are shades of gray and white, and called a grisaille, that I do for much more detailed work, and that kind of underpainting lends itself very well to real serious detail work. And so I do that sometimes as well. But I always start all of my paintings with an underpainting. So the process that I use is I start with a drawing, and it's usually a very accurate drawing. I don't just do a quick sketch. I spend a lot of time on my drawings because I don't like having to go back and fix things later. So I do put a lot of effort into doing a detailed drawing just with pencil on my canvas or my panel first, and then I go over that drawing, because it's graphite, with paint, and that seals the drawing in, and it keeps the graphite from smudging when I'm doing the underpainting. So that's the first step in my process. I do the drawing, and then I do a monochromatic underpainting, either brown or grays. Some people even use ultramarine blue. Some people use red oxide. You can do an underpainting in any color, really, as long as it's actually dark enough. So it's just a one color monochromatic underpainting. And the reason that I like doing that is because it establishes the values of my painting first. And that's the reason I found this technique to be much more doable, for me at least, because it separated the two components of a painting, value, meaning lights and darks, from color. And if I can get the values right, it's almost like a black and white painting. If I can get the values right, I know I can get the colors right. And frankly, even if the colors are wrong, if the values are still true, you can tell what it is. And so that's the biggest problem I feel in paintings, especially realistic paintings, is the values need to be right on. And so if you can get your values right with a monochromatic underpainting without having to worry about color at all, you're halfway there. And it's the first step in a realistic painting. It's also the way that the old masters used to paint back in the day. Vermeer, Bouguereau, all of them started with pretty much a grisaille or open grisaille underpainting just to get the values right before they even launched into color. So it works for me. It's a long process because you do have to wait for each step to dry, but for me it works pretty well. So today I'm going to be painting this flower, and hopefully I can get it done. It's one of the components of one of the larger still life over there, and I just blew up the reference photo of this one lily in here. These are daylilies. So the colors that I'm using today are, the main pigments are, and I always use a very limited palette. I typically use a warm and cool of each of the primaries, blue, red, and yellow. Today I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. I have some cadmium red on my palette, but I don't think I'll use it. I may use a little bit of it. Cadmium lemon, cadmium yellow, and white. I don't know if you can see my palette very well, but those are the colors I'm using. And I mixed up some puddles of color to use for this piece. Again, I really only use primary colors for the most part. For the greens, I'm just using a mixture of ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow or cadmium lemon to make my greens. I found in watercolor, even when I was painting in watercolor, I never found a green that I liked. So the green pigments that they sell are just too bright, and none of them are very natural. So I found it easier just to mix my own. So I'm going to get started with this painting. And the first step the first thing I do is I mix up a background color. And most of my backgrounds are dark because I like the contrast between dark and light. So I always mix up a background color, which usually is comprised of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, which this is. So this one is a kind of a cool black. It's got a lot of ultramarine blue in it, and it makes a nice background color. But I also use my background color as a shadow mix because I add a tiny bit of that color to all the other colors, typically, just to dull it down and darken it. So I'm putting some of my background on here with my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And then I'm going to launch into one of these, the petals on this lily. But I'm not getting too close because I like my edges to be soft. So in order to get soft edges, both parts have to be wet. So I don't want to get too close to this petal with my background. So I'm going to start on the center of this petal, and I've got some colors mixed up here. So the center of this lily looks like a really dull, dark green to me. So that's what I'm going to start with. And I'm using a small sable brush. My brushes are pretty much all sable brushes. And then the color goes kind of into a brownish color, and this color here is a mixture of cadmium yellow mixed with some burnt sienna and some shadow mix, actually, some of the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna.
And the layer underneath is completely dry?
It's completely dry, yeah.
How many days did it take to dry?
It takes one day. Raw umber is the fastest drying pigment, which is why I use it. And sometimes, if I'm painting in plein air, I use it as well, and it dries in about 30 minutes. But to be on the safe side, I usually let it dry for a day if I'm doing a still life in my studio. So this one is quite dry, but usually I'll do the drawing and the underpainting one day, and I'll start painting on it the next day, and it's perfectly dry. So.
Are you using a solvent at all?
Yes, the solvent that I use all Gamblin products. I'm using Gamsol, and I'm using Gamblin paints, and the medium that I'm using to thin my paint is I use Galkid Light. It's a Gamblin product, and I thin it down a little bit with Gamsol. So I do paint in thin layers, so I don't really want real thick paint. So I am thinning it down quite a bit with the Galkid. So I'm looking at this, and this shadow is kind of this color. So I've got these colors mixed up, and they're all these shadow colors are a mixture of the yellows, mostly the cadmium yellow, as well as some of the shadow mix, my black, and burnt sienna. So this is the kind of thing that you do need a soft brush for. So I do use sable brushes, and I get them at Blick, and I use the Blick Master Stroke sable brushes. And I find they do a nice job, and they're not really all that expensive. I'm sure you've heard of rosemary brushes. I've used those before, but I find it very difficult because they're hard to get. They get hung up in customs and so forth. So I don't know if any of you have used those. They're very nice brushes, but yeah. I go through a lot of brushes, so I don't want to have to wait to get them. So while I'm doing this, I'm making sure that I'm matching the values of what I'm painting, which is very important because that's the whole reason you put the underpainting on to begin with. So the shadows are in there. And so then when we get to this where it's lit up, then I'm going to switch to mostly a pure yellow. This is a mixture of cadmium yellow and cadmium lemon. And most of my paintings, especially something in yellow, take 2 coats of color. A lot of things I can get away with 1 coat of color if it's something dark and it doesn't need to be very bright. So some of those things only take 1 layer of color. But I find that yellow is very much more transparent than other pigments. And the surface I'm painting on is a panel that's covered with, it's a linen covered panel, and I get those from Trekal. I don't know if anybody's ever used Trekal products, but I use a Trekal panel. Those are my favorite. I use other panels, but I like the Trekal better. And it's oil primed linen. And I find that it just is such a nice surface to work on and for detail. And it still has enough tooth which is texture, that it will cover, that it will grab the painting, the paint well enough off of the brush and still allow me to get enough detail. With this kind of painting, it's kind of hard to do it on a rough canvas. I mean, it can be done on a rough canvas, you just can't get the same level of detail. So I'm using 1, 2, 3, 4, pretty much 5 shades of color on this, of various mixtures, trying to get my shadows just right. And somebody asked me how long it takes to finish a painting. I've timed it. It's about an average of 40 hours per painting, but that's from the very beginning until the very end. And by very beginning, I mean going out in my yard and finding something to paint, which takes a while, and setting it up in my studio and taking photographs of it and then changing it a million times. And between all that and then finishing the painting, it's about 40 hours. But then who's counting? We do this for fun, right? And because of that, I do work on a couple paintings, sometimes 3 paintings at the same time, because they do have to dry. Even though the underpainting will dry overnight, the other shades, depending on what kind of pigments are in there, take sometimes a few days. White, for example, is a very oily pigment, and if there's a lot of white in a painting, I'll need to wait a couple days before I try to paint on top of it. And by painting on top of it, I mean giving it a second layer. I also do a lot of glazing, which is pretty much the same as it is in watercolor. You thin down the pigments and put a very thin layer of pigment over an area, and it heightens the color. It can make it darker, just like in watercolor, and it brings out the chroma of the paint. It's a very effective technique, but that needs to be done on totally dry paint. So if I'm going to glaze something, I do need to let it dry for 2 or 3 days, especially if there's a lot of white in it. But glazing is a great technique that can be used with this type of painting, and it's wonderful to use it to correct things. I've used it to change the background color. I've used it to, because you can actually glaze pure color onto a black background and more or less change it to a bluish color or a greenish color if you want. So it's a really great technique. And if you are painting something, like if I wanted these lilies to be even more yellow than they are, I would glaze yellow right on top of them with a transparent pigment, like transparent yellow, transparent orange. And it really does bring out the chroma quite a bit. It can actually make it very, very bright. And so it's a great tool to use.
What medium do you thin it with?
I thin it with the same medium I'm using, Galkid Light. So I just, and I can actually demonstrate this on this one petal that's dry. I'll just demonstrate that for you. It's actually, do we have a trash can somewhere? I'll just throw it right. Sorry, I meant to ask that. Glazing is really a great technique, and it's a really good tool to use in this kind of painting, because it's really the kind of thing that you have to do. Thank you. When the paint is totally dry, but it's so effective. The old masters, of course, used that technique, that trick, for a lot of paintings. The girl with the pearl earring, I'm sure you've seen that painting, and her blue bandana. That's done in glazes of ultramarine blue, and Vermeer went right over a gray and white underpainting with a glaze to get that beautiful blue color in that bandana. And then I'm sure you've seen The Lady with the Red Hat by Vermeer, where the hat is extremely red. That was done with glazes as well. And the old masters used that technique very efficiently because it was really the best way to use pigments. Pigments back then were very, very expensive, especially blue. And so they used a lot of glazes to bring out the hue and the chroma in paintings when they didn't want to use a lot of ultramarine blue, a lot of red. They used glazes, and it really heightens the chroma because, as in watercolor, when you can see through layers of pigment, it actually makes your eye see it brighter. And so glazing is a great tool to use. So I'm going to demonstrate that with this, the petal that's dry. I'm taking a little bit of cadmium yellow, or cadmium lemon, and mixing a whole lot of medium in it, and it's a watery mixture. And usually I use transparent yellow for this because transparent pigments work better. But because it's dry, I can go right over that, and you can see how, hopefully you can see how, it really, really heightens the color on this. And at the end of every painting, when it's thoroughly dry, this is what I do to
do you mix your
bring out the
medium with Gamsol?
I do. I use a 2-to-1 mixture. I use 2 parts Galkyd and 1 part Gamsol.
Okay.
And it's Galkyd Light. The regular Galkyd is a little thicker, and it's more for people who like to do heavy body impasto work. Okay, so I've glazed this petal, and you can see how it is a lot brighter when you do that. You can really bring out a lot of color like that. In fact, I'm going to glaze the interior of this too, because it's actually darker than that. And I use this technique to deepen shadows at the end as well. At the end of a painting, I do a lot of glazing to deepen the shadows and to heighten the chroma on when I'm painting. So glazing is a great way to do that and to really fine-tune things. So this petal is pretty much done. And then I'm finishing the background around here, but I really need to soften these edges. So that's why I wanted my background to be wet. I'm taking a real soft brush and just blending both edges, which in my opinion is very important. I read somewhere that the human eye doesn't see hard edges unless we're staring right at something. So for realistic painting, it's always a good idea to soften your edges, and then if any of the edges need to be hard edges, that needs to be done at the very end, because you can always sharpen a soft edge, but you cannot really, you can always harden up an edge, but you can't really soften a hard edge very well after the fact, after the paint's dry.
You're going to use, for example, your main focus. Do you do hard edges around your main focus? And soft
Yeah,
edges
pretty
around?
much. What I do is you know how a composition, your eye enters the painting and you go through the painting and then you end up at the focal point. So hard edges are a good tool to use to guide the eye through the painting and into the focal point. But all the other edges pretty much should be soft edges, otherwise it just doesn't look right. Okay, so I move it on to this petal now. And I'm using Again, these are mixtures of burnt sienna and my 2 yellows and a little bit of my shadow mix. Any questions?
No, you said you use burnt sienna and what?
I'm using cadmium yellow
Okay.
mixed with a little bit of cadmium lemon
Right. And burnt sienna.
and burnt sienna, but then that's typically too bright, so I tone it down with my shadow mix, which is the black, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. So I just throw a little bit of that in there, usually until I get the right mixture, until it looks right. And then I try to mix up all my my shades ahead of time. But ultimately, when I get this done, I realize I look at it and then I always alter things after the fact, which is a nice thing about painting in layers. And the pretty much the reason that I went from watercolor to oil, I would get all done with my watercolors, look at them and think, if only I'd done this, that, and the other thing, and you can't really go back in watercolor, and it kind of really irritated me. So that's what I love about oil. Nothing's set in stone. You can always paint over it, which is a nice feature of oil. Because I very often will get done with something and go, oh my God, what was I thinking? So I let it dry and I just paint over it. I got real good at with watercolor. I wasn't very prolific at all. And the reason was I would get done with my paintings and I didn't like something about them, so I'd throw it away and just start over again. The same painting over and over and over again. And some of my best paintings are like the 4th try, and thankfully it's not expensive to paint in watercolor because it's just paper. But yeah, I got real tired of having to do that. I hardly ever finished a painting. So that's one of the things I like about oil. It's forgiving. There's probably a lot of watercolorists in here, right? Hold your hand up if you're a watercolorist. And how many oil painters do we have? Oh, wonderful. Okay. And how many do we have who have done both and transitioned? Anybody are still doing both at the same time? Oh, good for you. My hat's off to you. It is not easy to do, to paint both oil and watercolor. I tried. I thought, I'll never give up watercolor. I love watercolor. But I realized that's really not practical at all because, number one, I didn't have enough room for all I had this tiny little room I was painting in, and I didn't have enough room for all, the equipment's all different. The watercolor paper and the gator boards and the easel was the kind that has to lay flat, and the water containers and all that. And
I do my oils in my studio and my watercolors in my dining room.
So your whole house is your studio. Good for you.
Yeah. Mine too.
Yeah.
Have you ever dabbled in acrylics?
I just finished painting some decorated birdhouses in acrylic with florals and everything for the Poway Garden Club, but that's pretty much, and I've done, I don't know if any of you have done negative space painting, Linda Kemp, where you it's poured on and it's pretty much very abstract. I've done that with fluid acrylics. I've done some of that, but that's about it. I've never actually tried to paint a painting much in acrylic. And frankly, after painting these birdhouses for a few weeks, I've realized I do not like acrylics. I honestly think there's advantages to it because it dries fast, but I think that's one thing I really do not like about it. It dried too fast. I wasn't able to blend. I wasn't able to get any detail on there, and I wasn't able to do very many washes with it because it just, I don't know. I was painting on wood, so that was probably one of the reasons that it wasn't working out very well. But the only thing nice I can say about acrylics from my point of view is that you can clean it up with soap and water. But I'm not a fan of acrylics. I do think that they're very useful for a lot of things, but I don't see, like in plein air painting, I've seen people paint in acrylic, and I can't understand how they can do that because it just dries the minute you put it down, and you really can't do much. So anyway, okay, so I finished this petal, and so now I'm going to go on to this this bud here. So, let's see. I want part of my background to be a little bit on the light side over here. So I'm mixing a little bit of white in with my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna background, just so it has a little bit of interest in the background. It's not all the same color. Okay, so for this bud, I've mixed up my ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow for my green, and then I've made a little bit of a dark green by adding some of my shadow mix to that mixture. So it's cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of the black that I mixed up for this shadow. So I'm going to paint the shadow area first. And normally when I paint just about anything, I try to start with my darkest dark on any object, actually, which is another thing I learned with watercolor. You want to put your darkest dark on the paper so that you have something to judge it by. So I like to figure out which is the darkest dark and put that color on there first. Okay, so I've got my shadow there, and then there's a shadow over here. And again, I'm blending the edges of this bud into my background so that because I want this to be very soft. I kind of want this bud to fade into the distance. So I'm making these edges super soft. This is almost a lost edge over here. And then in the center of this bud, there's a little bit of this brighter green, which is ultramarine blue with cadmium lemon that I'm mixing in here, because these daylily buds have tinges of bright green. These daylilies are fun to paint, but they're one of the things, I try to paint things that come out of my yard for the reason that because it takes so long for me to finish a painting, they die. Everything dies. And so I try to paint things that I can go out and just pick more of. Unfortunately, I don't have daylilies, but my association does. So I go on walks in the morning, and I take my scissors with me sometimes when they're in bloom, and when no one's looking, I help myself to a few daylilies. And it works for me.
Are you modifying your composition though? You've taken a picture of it. Do you use Photoshop or any tools to kind of change elements of what you're going to paint?
Well, the only thing, not really, because I change the composition in my drawing, but I don't change the reference photo. And the reason is I need to know what it actually looked like. But what I do after I take my reference photo and look at it is as I'm doing the drawing on the canvas, I'll change things. And I sometimes do thumbnail sketches to rearrange, especially leaves. In florals, you know, the leaves go one way and you want them to go the other way. So I'll change that in my drawing, but I don't really change in Photoshop at all, because I do need to know what it actually looked like. Even if I change it, I want to know what it actually looked like. So, and it, you know, I'll set up a still life in my studio and then change it about 1,000,000 times. It's a time-consuming process. But I always find that once I set up a still life and once I get it the way I like it, then everything proceeds much more quickly. And I've tried to streamline that process, but it doesn't really work for me because I end up, if I don't take enough time at the beginning to get things the way I really want them, then I end up spending a lot more time at the end fixing things that I don't really like. So I figure it pays off in the end. Okay, so this bud is just about done, but I really want it to blend into the background. So I made those edges very, very soft so that it would sort of disappear. And then this part of it, there's actually another petal sticking out here, but I don't really want to paint another petal. I just want to add some color to the background. So I'm going to throw some yellow paint in here and just make it kind of a shadowy, yellowy thing in the background just to give it some interest. So I do paint landscapes sometimes, and I pretty much do landscapes pretty much the same way. I do an underpainting. Sometimes I do it in just dull primary colors, but more and more I'm still using the raw umber to do landscapes as well. I've been taking plein air painting classes, again from Pat Kelly. I take a lot of classes from Pat Kelly. And that's pretty much the way she teaches. An underpainting and then painting on top of it in color. And it works for me, even in the field, even doing plein air. It serves as, the underpainting serves as a guide, and it helps me get my values correct, which is important. Okay, so this is just a yellow blob that gives some interest to the composition, and when that's a little drier, I'll soften that a little bit more. But So who in here is a still life painter? Are you all? Okay. Yeah. When I started painting, I fell in love with those old 18th century botanicals, and I just loved that, and bought calendars of those types of things. But from time to time, I go to Trader Joe's and I buy flowers because I can't grow all of them in my yard. So last year at Easter, I did a painting with Easter lilies. And so went to Trader Joe's and bought a bunch of beautiful Easter lilies. And then had to go buy more and more and more. And as they died, you know, you buy a bouquet of lilies, and some of them look great and the other ones are dying. So I had to keep replenishing these Easter lilies. So I go buy another bouquet and another bouquet and another bouquet. And my granddaughter, who lives with me, loved them too. So she bought Easter lilies, put them in her room. Before long, we had a whole house full of Easter lilies. And then we started sneezing because if you've ever had Easter lilies, you know how messy they are. The pollen is just everywhere. Both of us were walking around sneezing all over the place. But I couldn't get rid of these Easter lilies because I wasn't done with the painting. So as soon as the painting was done, I went through everything and got rid of all the Easter lilies, and then vacuumed everything really well because there was pollen all over the house. So I frequently in my studio have bouquets or teacups or vases or something full of dead flowers. And the reason I keep them, even though they're dead, is because the shadows are still there, and I still need the setup, and I'm still painting the shadows, and I'm still painting. I need the colors. I need to see the colors, and I need to see the where the shadows fell and so forth. So I keep it there, and I have to be sure that when my housekeepers come, they don't go in there. They just throw all the flowers away. So I typically have dead flowers all over the place when I'm painting, because they don't stay alive for very long. Okay, so this has set up a little bit, so I'm just going to blend it a little bit more. It's just a background element, so.
So just worth a mention, if anybody is planning on getting some lilies to paint with and they have a cat, many types of lilies are toxic.
Oh.
Yeah, so if they nudge them and get the pollen, it's really.
The pollen is toxic?
I can't remember what is toxic. When I give bouquets, I just take the lilies out because I have too many cats.
Oh. Well, I think I read somewhere that some people snip the stamens out because they're just too messy. But then I needed to paint the stamens, so I couldn't do that. And there was pollen everywhere. So I try to paint from life, as we all do, but when I set up a still life, so I'm going to match these. When I set up a still life, I have to take photos because, of course, the still life, the things aren't going to live. Fruit and flowers is mostly what I paint. So I take photos for reference because inevitably, even though some elements will still be there, the fruit and the flowers will not. So at the very end of a painting, I'm usually painting pretty much from a photo. Although the other elements that aren't living, like a vase or a teacup or something, I still paint that from life. And for a long time I thought, oh, what difference does it make? But it really does make a difference. It makes a huge difference, especially at the end when you're painting details like highlights, the highlights and the lights on an object, like the lights on a vase, where the light hits and so forth. A lot of times that just does not show up in a photo at all. So I always leave the still life setup until it's totally done, because I need to be able to see what I'm really looking at. But I rely on photos. It's probably 50-50.
So are you controlling the light in your studio? I mean, some people have shadow boxes and...
Yes, yes. I bought one of those, forget what it's called. It's on wheels, and it's a platform that goes up and down, and it comes with sides. I made a shadow box out of foam board, black foam board, and taped it together with duct tape, and then I put it on a platform and so forth. But then I bought this thing that I could wheel it around. But yeah, I use black on both sides to black out all the other light, because most still lifes look best with one light source. And so to get that one light source, I have 2 windows in my studio, and to get that that single light source, I frequently have to use blackout shades on one of the windows, and I put the still life in front of the other window, and then I use the black panels to black out the light behind and on the side. So it's usually 2 sides that are open and 2 sides that are closed. Sometimes, depending on the subject, I've learned that certain subjects look better in light, natural light, and other subjects look better in lamplight. So I sometimes light things with a light, and I use a daylight bulb and a stand-up light that is shining right on there. And so I light it artificially. Some objects, especially man-made objects, some look a lot better with man-made or artificial light. But then other things look great in natural light. So I do both. And it works pretty well, because I frequently have 2 still lifes set up in my studio, and I only have room for one in front of one window. So I set up the other one and use natural light. And I use one of those daylight full spectrum bulbs that I'm sure you've heard of.
Is it a blue light or a warm light?
It's a cool light, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a rating, I forget what it's called, but there's websites that you can go and that will give you that information, but you can buy those at Home Depot. But it's usually a cool light, because actually daylight is actually a cooler light. And there's actually online resources for this kind of painting also. I wanted to tell you, if you're interested in classical realism and indirect painting, one website that I have used and taken classes from is sadievaleri.com. Her last name is spelled V-A-L-E-R-I. First name Sadie. She has an online atelier, and she teaches not only alla prima methods, but she's much more well known for indirect painting methods, classical realism. And she's her paintings are awesome. So if you just go to look at her paintings, it's worth it because her paintings are amazing.
Would you repeat that website?
Sadie, S-A-D-I-E, and her last name's Valeri, V-A-L-E-R-I. She has classes that you can just watch the demo, and then she has an online atelier that you can actually take classes and get feedback and so forth. And it's interesting just to see how she does it because she's quite good. Okay, so I'm smoothing this edge, and then I've got these shadows in here that I'm going to try to blend. Has anybody ever done indirect painting before in this way? You've done this? What kind of underpainting did you use?
I use burnt sienna.
Okay, burnt sienna, yeah. I've been seeing a lot of landscapes and plein air paintings that are using a red oxide, and you can see a little bit of the red coming through. It's kind of a cool technique and a cool look. But I always use burnt raw umber just because it dries quickly.
If you use the red oxide and use the Gamsol, it dries quickly if you're
Does it?
doing plein air.
Okay.
You can rough it in.
It does make a really pretty look. The red oxide is pretty.
Yeah, I replaced my burnt sienna with red oxide.
Does the red oxide dry faster than the burnt sienna?
I don't know if it dries faster, but it dries quick enough for me.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so I'm using some darks in here because I want the throat of this to recede back in there. How are we doing on time? Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to start on this one.
I don't notice any smell in the oils at all.
Oh, that's good.
Do you smell it after being that close to it?
I'm kind of immune to it at this point. Sometimes my studio has doors on it, and sometimes when I walk in there, the smell kind of hits me. But I have an air purifier that I use because my studio is right off my living room, and I really don't want those fumes all over my house. So I use the air purifier, and I think it works pretty well because I don't really notice my house smelling like oil paint, which is a good thing. I don't really know how toxic oil paint is these days. I know it used to be, but they've cleaned that up pretty well. Gamsol is supposed to be very safe, so that's one of the reasons I use it. It's not really a turpentine. I'm sorry, what?
How toxic is the chemical?
I don't know. It's a type of resin, but I don't know how toxic it is. You're welcome to read the label. Gamblin products are supposed to be pretty safe. That's what I've been told. I don't know whether that's true or not. But all oil paints are far more toxic than watercolor or acrylic. And some of the paints themselves, especially the cadmium colors, are carcinogenic, which is why a lot of people will not use cadmium colors these days. So they've come up with alternatives for the cadmium colors. A lot of the cadmium colors are very deep colors, and so people like to use them. But cadmium is a carcinogenic material, and so it's not. That's why I wear gloves.
But that's only in oils. Yeah.
Is it only in oils, not in watercolor? That I don't know. So in watercolor, it doesn't have. Well, cadmium's cadmium, yeah. So I would think if it's got cadmium, cadmium's right up there with yeah. It's a great pigment, but you have to be careful with it. But it used to be that I think some of the solvents used to be pretty bad, but Gamsol is supposed to be a lot less toxic. So.
They have the solvent-free gel that mixes with the.
And I've heard some oil painters don't really use solvent, especially out in the field in plein air painting. They just wipe their brushes.
Well, this I mix, if your paint seems, some colors are drier than others, if you take that solvent-free gel and mix just a little bit with the color, it kind of makes it more juicy or.
Okay, like a medium would.
Yes, like a medium.
I wonder if you can wash your brushes with that, though.
I don't know. I use,
Okay. Yeah, that works. That's probably a lot better.
They use it at the bird sanctuaries to get the oil off the birds, so I figured it's okay for my brushes. Oh.
What do you varnish, or do you varnish?
I do varnish my paintings. I use Gamvar, another Gamblin product. And it's great because you can take it off, which I have done many times. I'm sure some of you have finished a painting, gotten it all framed and everything, and then looked at it and go, oh my God, that needs to be fixed. I do that all the time. So you can't really paint on top of varnish. You shouldn't. And so many times I've taken it out of the frame, taken the varnish off, and you can take the varnish off really easily with Gamvar. You just use Gamsol and a rag, and it doesn't hurt the painting at all. If the painting, of course, is dry underneath, and just wipe it off, and the Gamvar varnish comes right off, and then you can fix your painting, and then you re-varnish it. And you cannot do that with other varnishes, like that other kind of, I forget the other kind of varnish. I've had a lot of problems with varnish. Most varnishes, if you put it on there and it looks uneven or bad, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't get it off. You could with straight on paint thinner, but I wouldn't take paint thinner to an oil painting. I'd take Gamsol, but not paint thinner. But yeah, the Gamvar varnish comes off really easily, and then you can just fix your painting and put it right back on there again.
So you mentioned that you were painting thin. How long do you let your painting dry before you paint it?
It depends on the pigments. This has a lot of white in it, so if I'm not going to glaze it, I could do it tomorrow. I could do it the next day. But if I'm going to put glazes on it, I let it dry for 2 or 3 days. Because with a glaze has a lot of thinner in it, and you're dragging the glaze over the surface. And I've run across problems where it lifts the pigment underneath when I'm trying to glaze. It starts to smear. So I don't take chances anymore. I let it dry for 2 or 3 days before I glaze. But if I'm just going to put another coat of opaque paint on it, if I were going to paint over these again, I could do it tomorrow with just opaque paint because it's dry to the touch. One of the reasons that I use the Galkid Light, it's a quick drying medium, and I used to use, I was going old school, Sadie Valeri, for example, the website I told you about. She's very traditional, and she uses linseed oil as her medium, which is what the old masters used to do. They used linseed oil or safflower oil as a medium, and it's very old school and it's very traditional. The problem is it takes days and days and days to dry. It's very, very slow drying. And so I started using Galkid because it's a fast drying medium. And it's dry to the touch in 24 hours, which means you can paint over it in 24 hours. But you can't do that if you're using linseed oil. So. Okay, so I've got one more petal to go, and then I'll put the stamens in there. Okay, so I mix all my puddles of color up before I begin. And then as I'm painting, I just use my brush and mix them, smush them all together to make various shades of the colors that I'm using.
That's why you didn't like acrylics. You do that with acrylics when they're dry.
Yeah, I can't figure out how acrylic painters. I realize you use those stay wet palettes with the wet stuff underneath, but yeah, I don't know how they do it.
It's also a great way to grow mold.
What, the stay wet palette?
Yeah.
Oh, big mold. Oh.
I noticed you've got a lot of oils on your palette there. Do you have will those be usable like days down the road?
Yes, a couple days. If I have one of those, like a lid that goes on here. This is one of those, it's actually a stay wet palette, a master's stay wet palette that people use for acrylic, but they do sell the glass insert that goes in there. And I put the plastic lid on it, and it does keep everything wet enough to use it at least the next day. Depending on the colors. Some colors, like the earth colors, dry very quickly, and so those I may have to switch out in a day or two. But other colors like white, that'll stay wet for days and days and days because it's got a big oil content in there. No, that's why I use that palette. The problem is that if I'm painting on two paintings at the same time, I may not use the same colors, but I do try to, for that reason, I do try to carve out enough time to work on a painting for a couple days at a time so I don't have to throw the paint out. Otherwise, it gets to be pretty wasteful. I have, there's a lot of people who use, I don't know if you've heard of using clove oil. You can take a little bit of clove oil and put it on a cotton ball and put it in your palette and then seal it, and supposedly that keeps the paint wet. The problem is, and I've done this, if you use too much, your paint will never dry. So you have to be careful with it. So I don't use it anymore for that reason. Because when you are painting and then you realize, uh-oh, it's not drying because you used too much clove oil, it'll never dry. So, but a lot of people do that. Okay, so I'm blending this. As I go, I'm blending the shadows into the other colors. And I almost never use bristle brushes. I know a lot of people use bristle brushes for oils, but for this kind of painting, you really cannot use a bristle brush because in blending, you're sort of dragging the paint over the surface of what's already there, and you'll just lift the paint. So soft brushes are a must.
Looks like you're painting really soft. Your strokes look really light.
Yeah, I'm sort of dragging the paint over the wet paint. Because blending it, you do need a soft touch with that. I have been using some of the Blick synthetic sables lately for the really small brushes, like the tiny little rounds and things to make lines, because I've realized that sable brushes are great, but the little ones don't hold their point, their tips for very long. They wear out very quickly. So I'm finding that the synthetic brushes just hold up better. So for tiny little brushes, I'm liking the synthetic ones a lot better. So I'm going to put the stamens in there now. Oops. This little brush is a synthetic sable, and a real sable, I've used this long enough but that by now a real sable would just go like this. But these synthetic sables hold up really well for the small brushes. They don't work as well for the larger brushes because they're a little firmer and they dig into the paint too much. So these stamens are a little bit lighter. Than the petals, and they're actually catching the light pretty well. We have any plein air painters in here? Okay. I've been doing more plein air painting lately. I find it very challenging because I'm not a person who can do anything very fast. And I've learned that the light changes, which is extremely frustrating. And when the light changes, you've got to either work faster or adjust. So I'm getting better at it. It's actually a form of alla prima painting, which has never been my friend. So.
What number of brush is that? It's around?
Yeah, this is a, it's actually a flat, it's a 0. It's a Blickmaster Synthetic Kolinsky flat 0. And it's very useful. I find myself using it a lot. I almost never use rounds. I don't know why. I just started using flats.
That's not a blick,
It's a Blick, yeah. Yeah. They're a lot less expensive than the real sables. Okay, so for the stamens, I'm going to use burnt sienna. So do I have until 3:15?
3:15.
Okay. Looks like I might actually finish this. So.
And I think if people are interested, we might ask you, and I've been kind of taking note of the materials that you've been mentioning.
Okay.
To email it to people on the distribution list.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Do you want me to give you a list? Well, I don't have it written down. I can tell you. Okay. All right. Ask me. I can't remember really what I went over. Ask me if you need to know anything else. And I'm just adding highlights to these stamens, to some of them.
Are you going to make the center any darker?
Probably. It does need to be darker. And that would be something that I probably would do with a glaze. I'd go back the next day and with my shadow mix, because that way I don't have to repaint the whole thing. But you're right, it does need to be darker. And all of these, I'm just going to try to make it a little darker right now, but all of these petals are a little bit dark in color. But one of the great things about glazes is that you can darken something without having to ruin the detail that you've already put into it. So if this were something I were doing at home, that's what I would do. Wait until tomorrow, or actually wait for a few days and then glaze it. That's the kind of the thing that I do at the very end. I adjust the values. I darken the darks always. And then I add highlights at the very end. And I boost the color with glazes. The highlights, meaning where the light's actually hitting, like on this vein right here, I would actually exaggerate that quite a bit. and this one right here. These areas.
So if you want to glaze the shadow, you just do that area. Do you have to blend it out or anything?
You blend it out, yeah.
You do blend it.
It's totally dry, so you're safe. So yeah, you'd mix up a thin layer, and then you would put it in the center, and then you would blend it out. And it blends out pretty well. If you're using a sable brush, it's actually very easy to do. And just like a watercolor wash, if you were doing that with watercolor, you'd put a wash over another color to make and blend the edges so that it blends in. And it works beautifully, actually. So, oops. So someone asked me about the detail on the teacup in this painting over here. So before we run out of time, I wanted to explain that. This gentleman was asking about how I do the detail in the teacup. And I do that a lot in my paintings, because I like to paint a lot of china. And I like to paint china that has designs in it. And a lot of people do that in an alla prima way, but I don't. But the way I do that is I paint the teacup totally white, or the vase or whatever it is, totally white, and finish it completely as if it were a white teacup, as if it were a white object. And then I let it totally dry, and I make sure that all the shadows and the highlights and everything are already in there. And then when all of it's totally dry, I take a pencil, an HB pencil, a really light pencil, and I draw the design on that dry item when it's totally dry. And then I take, actually glazes of color work better, because that's actually how china is done. It's done in glazes. So it actually looks more natural if you use thin glazes of color, which means that there's some areas I need to go over 2 or 3 times. But it dries pretty fast. Glazes dry pretty fast, so it's not a big deal. And I take, after I draw the design, I take my little tiny brush, and I just paint the design in there. And that's actually so much fun to do. It's actually the fun part. And it looks pretty good as long as you don't get the paint too thick and keep it in pretty much transparent glazes. And I do a lot of the blue and white china that way and so forth. And I go over some areas a couple times just to darken them. But for the most part, it's actually pretty easy to do if you do it that way. The reason I do it that way is because if I mess up, and I do, I can easily take a rag and wipe it off and just do it over again, because the cup underneath or the vase underneath is totally dry. So there's no harm in doing it, and you've got you've got some leeway there. You can screw it up and do it all over again, which I have done many times. And you don't need to repaint it if you don't get it right the first time. And so that's why it actually works well for me to do it that way. And I do a lot of china that way. So does anybody else have any questions? I think I'm done enough with this piece for today. That the way I would finish this is go over some of the areas to deepen the color. I would deepen the shadow in the center. I would add highlights to this. Oh, I lost there it is. I would add highlights to some of the sunlit areas, like right here and on the stamens. I would add more white paint, light paint. I would bump up the highlight on the vase. I would probably add some detail in this vase as well. And that's how I would finish it. So, any questions?
What I noticed about the flowers in your work is that the petals feel thin. The petals appear thin instead of leafy. I've seen a lot of paintings where there's the petals are leafy, and are there some specific things that you watch for to make sure that you don't end up with thick, fleshy petals?
Well, it's mostly because I paint so thin, and I know what you mean. It's one of the reasons why I always loved flowers done in watercolor better than oil, because of that reason. I don't like beefy petals. It just doesn't look like flowers. But I do paint very thin and in thin layers, and you don't really need to use thick paint if you build the layers up little by little. You still retain that thin look, and you still get all the detail that you need without having to put a lot of thick paint on there. I know a lot of artists like to add very thick highlights at the end, but I'm not one of those people, so I don't use thick paint at all. So that's the reason. It's just thin layers is all. All the prima painters frequently use thick paint because they have to get enough coverage and to get the detail that they want. So, and then people like that look a lot. So, more it's considered painterly, but that's not how I do it.